F. Scott Fitzgerald once said that the test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposing ideas in mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. Whenever I think about the 1992 Los Angeles uprising and the intervening 25 years since then, this quote is what always comes to mind for me. Before the uprising, a few years before, I remember my father took me to visit one of his friends who had a liquor store in South Los Angeles. I remember this particular visit because my father's friend got into a very heated argument with a customer. There they were, my father's friend on one side, this customer on the other, a crowded countertop separating them with that plexiglass barrier, and they were both shouting at the top of their lungs. I don't recall the details of the argument, but I do remember the heat. I remember the heat of that summer afternoon. I remember how hot it was inside that store. I remember the heat of the words that they were lashing back and forth. I remember thinking about how far apart they were from one another. One was an immigrant store owner who had a hard time with English and a very thick accent. He studied business administration back in Korea and had big dreams for his life in LA. But there he was, stuck behind those counters day in and day out. The other, I had assumed, was a local resident, one who most likely was sick of being treated with disrespect and in his own neighborhood. And that particular argument, that particular fight was part of a larger fight against decades of everyday slights and generational racial oppression. At that moment, I thought about how different and far apart they were, but I also thought about how similar they were as well. Because in that moment, what I saw were two men that despite their best efforts, found that their dreams were deferred, found that they were unable to live into their full potential and be respected as human beings. I saw their differences and their similarities at the same time, and it was hard for me to resolve those two things and function as a child, to figure that out. Not soon after the visit, the murder of Latasha Harlings happened, the beating of Rodney King, and then it seemed like the world caught on fire. I remember worrying about how my father would get home that night, April 29th. He had a dry cleaners on Olympic Boulevard, and he called us from one of those big, huge, brick-sized cellular phones that they had back in those days. He had to kind of crank it up to make the phone call. And he says all the roads were blocked and that he had to figure out another route to get home that night. That's all we heard. Again, so many disparate thoughts were sort of floating through my head that was hard to resolve. How could Sunjadu take the life of that little girl? How was Koreatown left to burn as an expendable buffer community to save the more valued white neighborhoods just beyond? How could the Korean American community, my community, be at the same time the oppressor and the oppressed? It was also clear to me how much of the weight of these contradictions, of the injustices of our society, laid at the feet of the African American community. Yes, Korean Americans lost a lot in those 3 days, but many were eventually made whole. But the communities that remained in South LA, the Black and Latino communities, are still waiting for their full measure of justice. It wasn't until I became more politicized in college, as a young organizer, that some of these things start to click for me. Was I able to start to resolve some of these questions and be able to function? It also helps that I got to work with the first-rate intelligences of the people who founded the Advancement Project in California, Connie Rice, Molly Munger, and Steve English. They're in the crowd, so let's give them a heads up. Over the years, I became more comfortable and facile with these contradictory truths and started to see another larger set of truths as well. That the power structures that both my father's friend and that customer struggled under, those structures were rigged. The truth is that the systems of immigration and housing, the systems of education and political narratives were all built to benefit a few and nobody in that liquor store that day. Eventually, I understood how the question of justice for the Korean community was tied to the fight for the justice for the Black community. Because until all of us are truly free, none of us are. That might explain how it is that I ended up at the Advancement Project and how I've stayed for 15 years dedicated to this particular mission. This mission that starts on this premise that our collective journey for freedom is inextricably tied to one another. And our job is to fundamentally transform the underlying institutions and these power structures. Since 1992, We've all come a long way. But there's so much more for us to do. There are many in this region that have yet to feel the full benefit of all of our collective work. But the last 25 years has shown us that California knows how to grow and learn even after getting knocked down. Now in 2017, we are yet again at this moment, and we've been knocked down by the election last year. So the question is, how do we hold opposing thoughts in mind and still function and move forward? How do we protect the most vulnerable and grow our power at the same time? How do we fight back against this administration while also doing the necessary work to transform our institutions right at home?